Well, welcome to what will be the last of the sessions that we're doing on Ilaria Ramelli and the interviews that Robin Parry conducted with her on apokatastasis. And the last question that Robin asked her was about the criticism that people who believe or believed in apokatastasis were taking the easy way out. In other words, what's the relationship between apokatastasis and growth? Now, tucked in behind Robin's question is, I think, a very typical response to the doctrine of apokatastasis, which is that it's a way of avoiding the hard part of the story. And it's a soft option, understandably motivated by compassion and a sense probably of moral horror at the doctrine of hell. But these critics say that Christians who hold that view are in fact just turning aside from the tough side of the gospel, which somebody once actually ironically called the bad news of the good news. Now, Augustine was the first to say this in the City of God. Right at the end, he actually talks about his opponents. It's quite interesting, that passage, because he wants to talk about it without rancour, and the motivation that he attributes to those who do not believe in eternal conscious torment is compassion, which he finds understandable. And as you read the text, you get a sense there was a tug in Augustine toward that same view, because he doesn't demonize these people at all. As a matter of fact, it's pretty clear from the passage that it was a significant position of his day. He called them the soft-hearted, I think. So, is it just soft-hearted? And in the last episode, we got the pagan version of this, which was that Plato or Socrates had said human beings need deterrence for good behaviour. Without deterrence, we'll just lapse into really a lawless life. Now, tucked in behind this, there is clearly a model of humanity that says, either in our original created version or as we are now, we need disciplined guidelines. We need deterrence. Without deterrence, if there is no final deterrent to bad behaviour, there will be an outbreak of lawlessness, an outbreak of immorality. So that's the question that Robin put to Ilaria. Did these early church fathers, in fact, embrace apokatastasis really as a way to get out of discipline, as a way to get out of, let's say, the challenging side, the discipleship side of life? Now, Ilaria, what you're going to hear when she speaks, of course, it's Ilaria as normal, high octane and compact with an Italian accent. And what I've done, I'll do again, was give you a bit of a summary, because I think that will give you a coat hanger to her replies. Well, and her reply falls, well, obviously she's going to deny that's the case, but she's going to deny it in three sections. The first is that these early church fathers, in their own lives, exemplified enormous discipline, discipleship, actually asceticism. And she doesn't quote this verse, but I thought about it the whole time I listened to her, which is when Jesus said, in trying to evaluate people's positions, by their fruits you will know them. That at the end of the day, the fruit of character, the fruit of your life will be the most telling confirmation of the goodness of your heart, and might be in the end the only way you'll really know. That's what Jesus advised us. She quickly goes through some of the major cases, and I just want to spell them out a little bit for you. And they've really got two sides to them. Let's call it a negative side and a positive side. The negative side is the way that these people endured torture, these people endured martyrdom in many cases. Not in all, but in many cases. That's the negative side. The positive side is that these people were architects of enormous social reform. Far from being lazy, they had a view of wealth that probably most modern Christians would find very confronting. That's particularly the case with the Cappadocian family, Cappadocian fathers. And they also had a view of personal piety that bordered on asceticism, withdrawal from life, long periods of meditation that most of us would find really impossible to comply with and might not even agree with. But none of them lived profligate, undisciplined lives. Now, she quickly mentions Origen and Maximus, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil the Great, and their sister Macrina. She mentions a couple of others, but they're the main ones. I thought I'd just quickly flesh them out for you. Origen. I think the treatment of Origen by the church throughout the last 2,000 years stands as a sad testimony to human nature and Christian human nature's ability to destroy somebody's reputation by stereotyping. Leave aside for the moment Origen's writings. Look at his life. I won't go into the details, but here's the main points. He was the child of Christian parents. His father was martyred when he was perhaps 12 or 13. He wanted to join his father in being martyred at that age. Famously, his mother stopped him. Then when he was in his very early 20s, he clearly was a genius. He clearly was a genius, not just intellectually, but as a teacher and a communicator. And he was pious and dedicated to God from a very young age. And in his early 20s, he was in the city of Alexandria. That's the north of Egypt. There was a large-scale persecution against the church, and it led to the evacuation of Christian leaders from the church. They fled. And in particular, the man who became his antagonist fled. His name was Demetrius, and he was the bishop of the city. And they all got out of the city. Alexandria stayed. Origen stayed in Alexandria during this time. He stayed there for pastoral reasons and to teach the believers. And he not only did he teach them, but he taught them brilliantly, such that he built quite a following. When Demetrius came back, you can just tell this was a story of jealousy. Clearly had a problem with a young man who was his intellectual superior, and professional jealousy was playing a part. Intellectual superior, that's bad enough, but on the courage scale, it's pretty obvious who's going to win that game. And this led to a lifelong rivalry and antagonism between Demetrius and Origen that really is the source of the eventual demolition of Origen's reputation. Fast forward to the end of Origen's life, and he moved to Palestine, and there he, at the as an older man, 60s, late 60s, he was tortured during the pogroms initiated by the pagan emperor Decius. He refused to either flee or to recant. He was tortured on the rack, according to Eusebius, 2-4 spaces. What does that mean? Well, the way the rack worked was they put your body on the rack and then they stretched it through it being pinned down, and every inch extra it added to your length was a space. The excruciating pain began in the first space. The fourth space was right at the end, by which time your body begins to crack. Your body begins to dislocate, beginning with the hips, shoulders, then moving to shoulders and spine. And when people went to the fourth space, they never recovered, obviously, and it generally led to their death, which it did with Origen. He didn't die immediately. He lasted a year or two in a broken man. And in that time, he spent it writing letters of comfort to the needy and to the saints. What are you going to say? It is so shameful that the church has treated his reputation the way it has. By their fruits you shall know them. As Jesus said to Peter, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." Maximus the Confessor was somewhat similar. Many years later, around about the 600s, he also is called the Confessor because he was tortured and died of his injuries. The really dark part of Maximus's story is that it wasn't a pagan emperor that did that, but Christians. I mean, it's almost inconceivable, but that's what happened. And his right hand was cut off and his tongue was cut out to stop him communicating. Now, Gregory of Nyssa didn't go through that kind of period of persecution, but his social reforms are famous because he's the first human leader, the first human being to philosophically criticize slavery at its roots as being fundamentally sinful, fundamentally wrong. He's the first. No, the Christians were a bit like the New Testament, probably ignoring it, living with it. If I'm a master, be a good master, but it wasn't a root and branch critique of the institution of slavery. That's what Gregory did. Very famous sermon, and as David Bentley Hart said in his interviews, if he'd done nothing else than that, Gregory would deserve a reputation as one of the great social thinkers of the Western world. Well, actually the Eastern world, because he was East. Basil the Great similarly started the world hospital systems, and they with their sister Macrina, who also started what today we might call a refuge for abused women and widows. The family, the Macrina, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa family, was very wealthy. They gave all their wealth away. They invested their wealth in these huge social enterprises. So there you have it. There you have it. They're the people who Ilaria refers to. And if I step back, I won't go into this now, but it's pretty obvious to me that these early church fathers were far more interested in growth than we are. I think the question of growth has got diverted in the evangelical tradition by a sin-based emphasis, which turns everything negative. The question of growth in the early church fathers had a very strong sense of discipline, but a very positive trajectory towards theosis. So let's leave that there. He mentions, Ilaria mentions Macrina on the soul and the resurrection, and she mentions Macrina's views very briefly as saying that evil is to be avoided because there is going to be purgative punishment, after death, and it's going to be tough, really tough. It's going to be a kind of a hell. So they didn't have a soft view of punishment. They had a tough view of it. It's just that it didn't end with eternal conscious torment. It was a view that had purification as the final end. So really it was like Socrates' view that I talked about in my last talk on Plato and hell. Socrates wanted a kind of purgatory after death to lead to improvement. He just couldn't contemplate that going to everybody. Whereas the early church fathers and Macrina saw that going to everybody. But that didn't mean, therefore, that it was an easy pathway. It's very tempting to dive into the book on the soul and the resurrection and talk about Macrina's, I say Macrina, Gregory wrote it, but he wrote it as a Platonic dialogue between Macrina and himself, where he's the pupil and Macrina is the teacher. It's really tempting to go into Macrina's views of growth. I'm not going to do that now because I think it would just take too much time, but I think sometime in the future it'd be well worthwhile to do that. So, have a listen to Ilaria. It's wonderful condensed material. And afterwards, I'll just add a bit of a postscript as to how we're going to pick up on some of these themes in upcoming Gospel Conversations talks.
So the question is, what did the early Christians who believed in universalism think the practical implications of that belief were?
You know, they were saints, most of them, they were saints. They were ascetics, Macrina, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, Evagrius. They were all ascetics. Some of them were even martyrs, or at least confessors. Origen surely was a confessor. He died after being tortured, qua Christian. So I would say that as you know, from the outside, people could say, well, if you believe that everyone will be saved, maybe you live very badly, because then you know that you will be saved. This is what Macrina, especially in the sister of Saint Gregory of Nyssa, in this beautiful Platonic dialogue, De Anima et Resurrezione, so on the soul and the resurrection, which is a remake that Gregory of Nyssa does on the Phaedo of Plato, but on the topic of apocatastasis, which is extremely important, is one of the most important things that the early Christian wrote. So here, Macrina say, look, even if you believe in apocatastasis, you should never do evil. So she warns that. It's not that because doing evil implies that then you will have to have your evil removed, and this will be extremely painful. So they were not lenient in the least for that. They say removing evil will be extremely painful. It will actually be a hell, even though they think maybe maybe it's not eternal, but it may last so long aeones that it may last the long duration of the world. So it's not anything lenient or you know, something that you can live badly because you know that you will be saved at all. Actually, and in their own lives, they were all saints. Actually, well, Clement is not a saint, but still, you know, he worked as a teacher, and he was not an outspoken, you know, speaker of the program, but still he was. Origen was an ascetic, a philosopher, a teacher, and a saint, or surely a martyr in the sense that he dies after tortures. Gregor of Nyssa was a saint. Macrina was a saint. They live in a monastery. Their brothers and sisters, they were also, I think that also Basil, even not outspokenly taught, and they were all saints. They live in an ascetic way, in a very poor way, austere way, and they tried, of course, also to help others. Basil did a lot, for instance. Evagrius was a father of asceticism, but also Anthony was an Origenian, actually. I think that he believed also in apokatastasis, and he was the founder, you know, of monasticism, of people living in the desert, and you know, they were people who were living holy lives, and so it's not that because they believed in apokatastasis, but Gregor, also Saint Isaac of Nineveh, he was a bishop, and then he was a hermit in the mountains, and he has written wonderful things, and he thinks he's one of the most outspoken supporters of apokatastasis. He thinks that the cross of Christ is just the proof of the attitude of God towards humanity. Humanity was sinning, and he sent Jesus Christ in order to save them with the most horrifying kind of death of all. For what purpose, he asks? For the purpose of showing the love of God for humanity. And this is already what Origen was saying. So why is that Satan, who at the beginning he was Luciferus, he was the angel of life, he was perfect, so why did he fall? Even before Adam, Origen was more you know, interested in Satan. So why did Satan fall? Because he did not have the proof of the enormous love of God, because that proof came later, came with the cross of Christ, actually. And so this is why he could fall. Otherwise he would never have fallen. But he thinks that given this proof and given the action of God, both he and Gregor of Nyssa even more outspoken, there will be this miracle of the conversion even of Satan, which for them is a glorious mystery, is nothing blasphemous, is a great glorious mystery of God.
Well, I trust you found Ilaria's talk illuminating. I wanted to conclude by adding a postscript to what you've just heard on the question of growth. Clearly, this final topic, raises the question of growth. What does growth mean? Because the flip side of punishment is growth. They're actually two sides of one coin. And I think the real game is which one's the master and which one's the servant. If your primary model is a forensic model of justice and a forensic model of, therefore, necessary punishment, then that's the master, and growth is subordinated to that picture. Quite clearly, the early church fathers did not have that model. For them, the superordinate model was growth, which culminates in theosis, participation with God. And punishment and discipline is a means to that end. Now, it's incredibly important to see that these are two sides. They're twins. They're two sides of one coin. And I think people have not done justice to themselves or the topic by looking only at one side of the coin and not at the other. In other words, you need to look at them as an integrated system, and there's no way you can pull them apart. The only thing will be how you integrate them and which is primary and which is subordinate. I want to foreshadow that we're going to be doing an upcoming series with Ben Myers in Gospel Conversations, and there'll be 2 or 3 sessions with Ben on what was the early church fathers' model, a patristic model of growth. I think it's going to be extremely illuminating, because we've got models of growth in the 20th and 21st century focused around the word discipleship that I've personally always found either inadequate or boring. We can all trot out the formula, and it's always seen to me to be at best trite, just indefensibly not interesting. It's a compliance model to behaviours. I've thought that since I was a teenager. You could probably understand from these comments why I was always hard to handle at the youth fellowship I went to. But I always really thought that. And so I'm going to really look forward to what Ben's going to say about their models of growth. Now, it's not to say their models of growth were perfect or that we need to agree with them, but they certainly seemed to me to be, from what I've read, far more deeply thought through. And this will then culminate in our August conference when we are sponsoring John Beer to come out to Australia, the world's leading scholar on the patristics. And we'll say more about that as time goes on. But the 3 talks he'll be giving at our Saturday conference will be clustered around what it means to grow up into Christ according to the Church Fathers. He's going to look at 3: Irenaeus, Gregory of Nyssa, and Maximus the Confessor. I want to just finish by saying that I think Ilaria's talk finished, and it was when she finished in her final section on the fall of Satan and why Satan fell. And she says they speculated that he fell because he did not grasp the love of God. That's intriguing, because it's diagnosing his fault in positive terms, not negative terms. It wasn't as if he had intrinsic evil in him that flourished. It's because he didn't grasp the love of God. Now, that's a platform, I think a seed is a better word, to a whole model of growth that is quite an alternative to a forensic model of growth, which will be negatively defined, i.e. growth becomes the purgation of sins. It's scourging, it's scouring out the sins from ourselves. Now, plenty of time in the past I've critiqued that as essentially a vacuous model, because it's just totally negative. So yeah, when I've got rid of all the sins, what then? I mean, what's the positive vision? So I'll leave you with 2 thoughts about growth, and these thoughts are thoughts that have guided my mind for many years, and not just in Christian circles, but just generally, because so much of my professional life has been around growth and what growth means. Educational programs, change programs, strategic renovations of broken systems. So what does growth mean? There's 2 big questions whenever you are in the field of growth. The first is you've got a choice. You can define an educational or growth program sequentially, or you can define it backwards from the outcome. And that's what great teachers do. That's what great parents do. It's what great pastors do. If only the church did it more. What's the end game? I need to draw a picture in my mind and to my students of the kind of character, the kind of capabilities that will emerge at the end of this. And great educational programs do that. They work backwards. So that's the first thing. The issue of growth raises inevitably the issue of what's the end, which is why the eschatology becomes so important. Having clarified that, what your picture of the end is, the second big question is, well, okay, how? How are human beings wired for growth? I'm not talking about the programs, I'm talking about the psychology of growth that's within us humans. And that is very much a motivational issue. And I've thought about this as a parent, I've thought about this as a teacher, and I've seen in all cases that what seems to turn growth on is hope and love and vision. My eldest son, Tim, I'm sure he won't mind telling this story, had a sketchy school career, like a lot of boys, very sketchy. He was a scallywag, really, a lovable scallywag, who thought our sending him to a wonderful boarding school was a great investment in his social life. And he left school with a very ordinary pass in the HSC, and then we tried to get him involved in some university programs. He didn't like it, and really his life was meandering, was feckless and directionless, and he spent a lot of time doing waitering jobs in nightclubs, and it was not looking good. Then his mother, rather prophetically, had a impulse to enrol him and his brother in a school, a graphics school to do with computer graphics. I think it was called the Computer Graphics College. And they reluctantly agreed. Tim wandered almost by mistake into animation. And by the way, when he was at school, the one thing he loved was drawing and art. He loved art. And he was very good at it. He actually got the art prize at the school. The other thing he loved, he's a great sports person. So he's very kinesthetic. So he loves the body and its movements. He was a great swimmer. And, he's now one of the best parachutists in the world. Or his team was. They came second in the World Championships. So the one thing he did at school was, in his science textbook, he never listened, but what he did was, if you can remember, you could do little drawings on a book, and you could animate them by doing them in subsequent pages, such that if you flip them through, they animated. And he had this project, that's all he did in his science book. And the entire year was just waiting for the next production out of his science classes. That's what he loved. So, guess what? That's animation. He got into animation, and a fire was lit inside him almost overnight. He became actually extremely successful at it. I won't go into that and where his career's gone now. He's actually the CEO of our technology startup company, which is in artificial intelligence. But he went from somebody who from the outside looked lazy, academically lazy, to obsessed. Only word for it. It would be nothing for him to work all night once he got into animation. Nothing. The task was everything. And it was done, not out of fear, not out of compliance. You could never, ever make Tim do anything out of fear, but out of love. So I suppose that's an example that a lot of us could align with, that it seems that what motivates humans to really superior performance are positive things, not negative things. Vision and love. And of course, that's the whole world that's now emerged as positive psychology led by Martin Seligman. So the two big issues of growth, and they might set a foundation as we go into this. There'll be an episodic series on growth happening out every month or so, is what's the end game of growth and what motivates humans to grow. And what you've just heard is, for the early church fathers, the end game was positive, theosis, and that end game that's got no hell in it actually is motivating. That's the second issue, because love is what motivates growth, not fear. Okay, hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and we'll just kick on in coming days with some topics that appeal to me, and then every month or so we'll have interviews with Ben, and then we'll culminate in what we're all looking forward to, which is John Beer's August visit. And we'll be advertising that, and registrations will be coming out soon.